Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ernesto, and we have a wonderful opportunity today to discuss the new book by Verdeja, Hanson, Policing the Revolution, which offers critical insights into policing armed conflict and illicit markets in Venezuela and the Global South more broadly. To our virtual audience who are following today, please remember that during the presentation you can post questions using the button below your viewing window. Rebecca Hanson is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law, as well as at the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. She's the co-author of Harass, Gender, Bodies, and Ethnographic Research, and the co-editor of The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Revolution, Crime, and Policing during Chavismo. And as you know, she's a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute, where she will continue her work drawing on data that she has collected, as she will discuss today, over a 10-year period in Venezuela. Rebecca, we are wonderful to have you with us. To discuss, Rebecca will present about the new book for about 15 minutes, and then we will have comments by three discussants. The first one is Mayra Ortiz, who is a PhD student in political science. Mayra is a former researcher at the Observatory on Disappearances and Impunity in Mexico, and she's part of Documenta Desde Abajo, an interdisciplinary project on violence and community mobilization in Guerrero in Mexico. Her research focuses on criminal justice, human rights, social movements, and violence in Latin America, and she's currently investigating specialized prosecution of it. Thank you, Mayra, for joining us today. Our second discussant is Ernesto Verdeja, who is an associate professor at the Kellogg Institute for International Peace Studies and a Kellogg Institute Faculty Fellow. Ernesto is an expert on genocide and mass atrocity prevention, early warning systems, transitional justice, and political reconciliation. He's also the executive director of the Institute for the Study of Genocide. And thirdly, we will have our third discussant today. Is going to be Rachel Sweet, who is joining us online. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us today. She's an assistant professor of politics and global affairs at the Kellogg School of Global Affairs, and a core faculty member at the Kellogg Institute and a Kellogg Faculty Fellow. Rachel investigates armed conflict, governance, and state capacity, and she's an expert on methodologies for studying civil wars and armed violence. She has served as an expert with the United Nations and other international organizations. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for sharing our work, and thanks to all of you for being part of the presentation. Rebecca?
Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everybody at Kellogg for putting the event together. And specifically, I want to thank the Discussants because they received rather late invitations to discuss the chapter, so I really appreciate them agreeing. So as you probably all know, the talk today is going to be based off of a book of mine that's coming out in March, Policing the Revolution, the Transformation of Coercive Power in Venezuela's Security Landscape, or Chavismo. For people who are interested, I have a discount code, so if you would like to purchase the book, just email me. My email address is up there, and I can share that with you. So Haniwa mentioned this book. I got a lot of other projects done. In the meantime, I was trying to get this project done. It ended up being a much longer project than I had anticipated. And so I'm very excited, but also incredibly relieved to be finally presenting on the project. It felt like it was never going to get done. So what I'm going to try and do is, we'll see how successful it is. I'm going to try and provide you kind of an overview of the arguments that I make in the book, as well as kind of what I try to accomplish in the chapters, and I've kind of grouped that by theme. It's a lot to go over, hopefully not too much, but I wanted to give you some context because each of the discussants is going to be discussing a couple of chapters in depth, and so I wanted to give you some context for what those chapters are about. So yeah, the research that I conducted in Venezuela, this is based off of ethnography, over 200 interviews, focus groups, and surveys that I conducted over a 10-year period beginning in 2012. I took a cubist approach to ethnography, which basically is trying to make sure that you're getting various perspectives on a similar phenomenon or topic. So I was working with a couple of different populations for this project, including police officers, police reformers and residents of the barrios in Venezuela. Just a quick note about that term. In much of Latin America, barrio refers to just like a neighborhood or a sector. In Venezuela, it refers specifically to lower and working class sectors, or what are also called popular sectors. So when I talk about barrios or popular sectors in the talk, I'm referring specifically to lower and working class sectors. So I put forward three main arguments throughout the chapters. One, so we know quite a bit now about the relationship between kind of the right and right political parties and governments and its approach to crime, security, and policing. So we have research showing that the right has really driven heavy-handed and repressive policing and security policies across the region in the United States and in Latin America. The right has also been very associated with neoliberal policies, right, that have contributed to what scholars now refer to as a pluralization of violent actors and the outsourcing of security. And we, of course, have a lot of scholarship on the left in Latin America, particularly around the time period of what's known as like the pink tide or the left turn that occurred in the early 2000s. But despite this like massive body of scholarship we have on the left, there's very little research asking how leftist governments in the region have tried to deal with the issues of crime and insecurity that have increased over the past 20 or 25 years. And we have very little understanding of how they approach issues like policing. So I see this as one of the big contributions to the book. And what I argue is that leftist governance in Venezuela produced outcomes most often associate, oh, sorry, I've got you, I don't have this thing. There you go. Leftist governments in Venezuela produced outcomes most often associated with the right and neoliberalism, but through different mechanisms. So what I'm referring to here are things like the pluralization of armed actors, outsourcing and individualization of security, and what I refer to as the dispersal of coercive power. So again, these have been studied in Latin America, but tend to be very associated with kind of right-wing governments and governance. And so what I argue is that rather than the product of neoliberalism or even transitions from authoritarianism towards democratization, these outcomes occurred in Venezuela under a leftist government that really supported social security, social policy, social welfare, but then later turned into an authoritarian project, so a very different context. So the second argument that I put forward in the book, so the Chavista state and political project in general is oftentimes characterized as having started out as completely authoritarian from the beginning and becoming even more so over time. So there's kind of a linear story that gets told about Chavismo. I refer to this in the book as the idea that Chavismo was always already authoritarian. And I think this characterization overlooks what David Smiley, Veronica Subijaga, and I have called revolutionary governance. We use this concept to refer to state fragmentation that's produced by Chavismo over time as different factions within Chavismo kind of struggle against each other to define what type of project they're really engaging in, and also to gain control over things like tolerance, power, and authority. So I argue that the Bolivarian Revolution was defined by highly contested and contrasting visions that resulted in state fragmentation and chaotic and inconsistent security policies. And finally, the third argument, so there's still a lot of scholarship around that explains and understands police actions and police violence as the result of state interests and what the state is trying to accomplish, right? This is even more so the case in context of revolution and socialism, where the police are very much so thought to be carrying out all of their actions based off of protection of a new political project or a revolutionary project or something like this, right? And so I try to destabilize this idea a little bit in the context of Venezuela, arguing that police violence in some places and times must be decoupled from state interests. And in these moments, police violence can be better explained as an attempt to resist the state and its political effect. So a note about this, so in questioning kind of this universal alignment that tends to be made between police actions and state interests, I'm not suggesting that police actions in the final instance do not serve state interests, right? So where police officers see their actions either righting the state's wrong or resisting its interests, the end result can still benefit state actors. In short, police violence can still be politically useful even when the police are not politicized. So this last point I'm not going to get into quite so much in the following slides, but I'd be happy to kind of discuss it further if you would like to. So jumping into the chapters. So chapters 3 and 7, what I'm trying to do is kind of trace the evolution of security policies and approaches to policing during the Bolivarian Revolution, particularly paying attention to differences between Chavez and Maduro. In chapter 3, I look at a police reform that was implemented between 2006 and 2013. This was initially what I thought my dissertation research and then this book was going to be completely about. But so the reform was really interesting to me because it was being led completely by human rights activists who had goals like getting, the military out of policing, reducing police violence. They created a number of new institutions like the Policía Nacional Bolivariana, which is the police force that I worked with mostly in the Bolivarian National Police Force, as well as the country's first experiment with a national police university. And so the image is at the top there, the mural within one of the sites of the National Police University that I took a number of years ago that's dedicated to victims of police violence and police abuse. So this, approach, this human rights oriented approach led by human rights activists, very much so dominant. And you can even see this in the aesthetics, institutions that were created by the reform. So in chapter 3, I get into how the reform was derailed by internal conflicts within Chavismo. It never really consolidated. And when Chavez dies in 2013, he's really the main proponent of this police reform. He dies in 2013, and when he dies, the police reform really dies with him. So after he dies, there's a snap election between the Chavista candidate Nicolas Maduro and the political opposition candidate Enrique Capriles. And Maduro wins this election very, very slightly by less than 2% of the vote. So he enters, his first administration in an incredibly weak position. He has very little legitimacy, very little popularity. And so what I look at in chapter 7 is that one of the ways that he thought about shoring up support within key institutions within Chavismo, particularly the military, was by rolling back this police reform and not only returning to, but intensifying the militarized policing that has historically characterized the country. So this results in what Veronica Zubillaga and I have referred to as systematic killing during this time period, so really from kind of 2015 onwards. And so this image at the bottom here demonstrates, some of these are pictures of the militarized police raids that get implemented during this time period. So you have lots of military and police officers kind of swarming into the barrios, and you can see that aesthetically they're very much so trying to associate themselves with death. So the two initiatives that I discussed in chapter 7 is the Operación de Liberación del Pueblo, or the OLP, which was implemented in 2015, and the Fuerzas de Acciones Especiales, which were created in 2017. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about the FICE. So I just want to note that these are special tactical units that were created within the National Police Force. So the National Police Force gets created by police reformers with the goal of constructing a police force that respects human rights and does not use excessive use of force. And eventually under Maduro, these special tactical units are created in the National Police. And it's during this time period when the OLP and the FICE are implemented that Venezuela's police forces become the most lethal in the world for a number of years. So one of the reasons why systematic killing takes place in the context of these initiatives, which I discuss in chapter 7, is something that officers refer to in their interviews as a green light to kill for the Ministry of Justice. And so what they talk about is that they have received a green light from the Ministry of Justice to be able to kill. There's not only impunity to do so, but incentives to do this. So for example, when we interviewed one PNV officer and a FICE member in, I think this was in 2018, he told us, if someone has a warrant out for homicide, it's a gift. We have a green light to kill them. These are people that have to be eliminated. They've made this country a living hell. If it wasn't for us, for the FICE, we would be overrun with delinquents. So it's important to note here that the police during the OLP and the FICE were not only given a green light to kill for people who had warrants out for homicide, they were given a green light to kill for anyone who had warrants out for their arrest, anyone who had any kind of interaction with the criminal justice system, and then associates or friends or acquaintances of those people. And so it's during, in this context that police start to kill about 5,000 people a year, an incredible increase in police violence over a short period of time. And as this quote kind of references, these are not political killings. I think violence, particularly police violence in Venezuela, oftentimes tends to be characterized as largely political, and that's not the case. And the people who are dying in these initiatives are poor men, or men who live in the barrios in poor and working class sectors, right? They're very much so targeted by them. So essentially, the people who are being killed by these initiatives are the sectors that have historically supported Chavismo. Okay, so the next few chapters that I look at, chapters 4 and 8, are thinking about kind of at the same time that police reform is being implemented and this then systematic killing is occurring. There's also what I refer to as a dispersal of coercive power, which I look at in chapters 4 and 8. And this basically refers to the fact that the government engages in constructing relationships with different non-state armed actors that disperses coercive power across multiple armed groups that are in competition with each other. So I look at first these relationships that eventually become stable with groups that are now known as colectivos. He started out as leftist armed community groups in Caracas, and then eventually kind of evolved under Maduro's government into parastate groups. So this begins in 2002 and has really evolved into the present. And then in another chapter, I look at the volatile and fragile relationships the government has constructed with gangs from 2013 to 2015 and 2017 to the present. Due to time constraints, I'm just going to try and go over really quickly the first type of relationship, which is between state actors and between the colectivos. So these relationships are really interesting because they start in 2002. For anybody familiar with Venezuelan knowledge, you'll know that there was a failed coup d'etat that took Chavez out of office for 48 hours. He comes back from the coup d'etat, but when he comes back, his administration is faced with this question of who guards the guardians. And this is because one of Venezuela's most important security police forces, the Metropolitan Police, participated in the coup d'etat. So basically they're in the position of like, we can't really trust our police forces, or we can't trust our police forces. Who can we trust to protect our political project? And so one of the ways that some state actors within the government try to deal with this issue is by constructing relationships with these armed groups that already have a leftist ideology. So they already have like an ideological affinity to work with the government. So these relationships look very different under Chavez and Maduro. Chavez maintained relatively inconsistent and somewhat fragile relationships with the colectivos, that is oftentimes not characterized that way. But despite the fact that they're inconsistent in the kind of the collective imaginary of Venezuela, relationships between the government and the colectivos are incredibly tight. And that can be seen in this graffiti they have up here on the slides. So this graffiti is from Western Caracas, which is where the colectivos initially came from or originated. On the one side, there's a water tower that's overlooking Western Caracas. That on the one side is the face of Hugo Chavez. On the other side is Lina Ron, who was one of the heads of La Piedrita, which is one of the oldest and largest colectivos in the country. So basically you have, two important figures side by side kind of walking through Caracas. On the other side is some graffiti that I saw across Western Caracas that basically declares that Chavez is Tupamaro. So the Tupamaros are another colectivo in Caracas. And basically what this graffiti is claiming is that he's one of their members. He's like one of us, right? And so there's a very tightly established relationship by this graffiti and other kind of popular discourse. It then has really important implications for how the police see their role in the state and how they understand their own power and legitimacy. And that's kind of one of my main interests here, is kind of thinking about how these relationships with non-state armed groups really influence how the police see their own role within the state, right? So the police, when I talked to them about relationships between the colectivos and the Chavez government, they would often kind of position the colectivos as actual defenders of the revolution, and the ones who were being defended by the revolution. So for example, two of the police officers that I spoke with, one told me, just a few weeks ago, a PNV officer was shot wearing a bulletproof vest. The bullets went right through, but the government doesn't care that the colectivos have better weapons than the little pistols we have. They don't care. Another police officer told me the police have absolutely no control over the colectivos. In fact, I know officers who were jailed for trying to arrest their members. I don't present these quotes as like actual representation of what's going on the ground. The police act very much so exaggerated in control of how the colectivos have. I mean, they do kind of get to some of the, but to a large degree, it's an over-exaggeration. But what I am interested in with these quotes and with this data is really thinking about how officers come to believe that they have been replaced by non-state armed groups, right? That the government has extended power and impunity to non-state armed groups, and that there's a struggle between the police and the colectivos over legitimacy and power and resources, one that the police very much so see themselves as losing. As the relationships between the government and the colectivos change from Chavez to Maduro, the colectivos come to be seen not only as an external threat to the police, and a threat outside of the state, but one that's internal to the police. Because there is some evidence that colectivo members start to be incorporated into the special tactical unit we talked about before. So there is some evidence that colectivo members become members of the FICE. And this creates a concern among police officers that there is a cancer that's growing within the national police force, right? And this cancer results in a lot of conflict and fragmentation among police forces oh gosh, I don't know how to start these videos on here. Oh well. So these are videos that show a public fight that takes place between the FICE, between the National Police Force and a different police force, the Venezuela's investigative police force, they say. So if I could start the video, you would see police officers.
Which one would you like me to start?
But either one is fine, or both is great.
If I can get it.
Yeah, so this shows the CSPC taking a FICE officer, trying to take him down to this station because they've arrested him. The FICE show up, intervene the CSPC, and they literally engage in a public brawl on the interstate, shutting down traffic for a couple of hours. And this happens in a couple of different moments. This isn't the only one. Okay, so just drop it really quickly, so I only have a couple of minutes, so I'll skip past a couple of things. So chapters 5 and 6, I'm looking at what people refer to, what scholars refer to as the individualization of security. Again, this tends to be associated with neoliberalism as the state kind of rolls back its resources, rolls back services. So the idea here is that when the state rolls back its resources and services, individuals and communities take on those services and functions, and the security is one of these things, right? And so in chapters 5 and 6, I'm really thinking about how this impacts men and women differently. In chapters 5, I'm thinking about how is it that men who grow up in unsecured spaces, in places with incredibly high levels of violent conflict, how does it influence the way they think about using violence? And then how does that influence the violence they use as they become police officers? So I'm really trying to think about how socialization within conflictive context result in police violence later on. In chapter 6, I'm looking at the ways in which women become part of security in this context as mothers, because it's very much so believed that women in the barrios, mothers in the barrios, are giving birth to delinquency. And so the idea of a lot of security initiatives in this context is to teach women to be better mothers as a kind of as a solution to the problem of crime. I had a couple more things, but I will stop there because I already talked for way too long. So thank you so much, and I really look forward to hearing what Discussants have to say.
I'm going to talk about chapters 5 and 6. I will begin. So first, I have to say that both chapters are fascinating, and the qualitative work that you've done is amazing. And so one of the first things that struck me in this chapter is the backgrounds of the men who live in the barrios. So like they can be both police officers or members of criminal organizations. So that's something, so there are multiple similarities between the people who are in charge of policing, but also the members who are like committing crimes, right? So that led me to wonder a lot, who are the people who end up joining the police and who are those young men that end up in criminal organizations, right? Because, I mean, what's the difference, what makes them different to choose one path or another? And also, well, Rebecca, like besides the place of upbringing, like some of the similarities is like the way they are socialized regarding violence. And like that's a striking similarity between, which could be two groups. And one of the police officers talking about like his experience. So like coming from this barrio, I thought it was like a very good representation of what's going on. So he says that chamos, young guys in these barrios, have a decision to make. We can become malandros, like criminals, or choose to do something with our lives, right? So this is like this choice between becoming a police officer or a member of a criminal organization. And I think this is a choice that it's present, that it's not restricted to Venezuela or authoritarian regimes, right? So in Latin America, thinking the significant amount of violence that's a choice that a lot of young men have to do. And I mean, if we can look further of young men in other countries, I think that would be like a constant topic. And we still know very little about who are the men who join the police or state armed groups in Latin America. So, and I wonder if like research tools provided like by narrative criminology, for instance, can provide some guidance about like what representations that these men have influence their life choices. And I've seen like a couple of pieces on why lawyers become public defenders. So and like that life choice is connected to some of the narratives that they like talk themselves about. So I think like that would be like a very interesting topic for further research. And additionally, the second topic that I thought that it was super interesting is about the police reform. So this police reform that you were talking about, and here it's a very good representation on how like the personal histories of the people impact policy implementation. And I'm saying this because the personal histories of those young men with violence and masculinity and how to behave like regarding violence, you show how those histories impact the preference around police reform. And it was super, super interesting. So these young men who were being taught in a university, a national university, where there was like human rights model for policing, where there's like a lot of rules that are like recognized by international treaties and international organizations, were taught to them, and their lived experience put like a very striking difference on it just didn't make sense to them to implement these rules because they came from the barrios, so they knew how like the reality works. So using a particular standard about the uso progresivo y diferenciado de la fuerza, which means that that the police needs to take like progressive measures, like starting with dialogue, and then just and the last resort is using force. So that's like the idea. And I thought with the qualitative work, you show how that was like not up for discussion. So when they were like listening to that, it just didn't make sense. And because they were thought like in this very hyper masculine context that you need to strike first to be respected. So you cannot start with dialogue. You need to start with domination and with violence even to be able to gather respect for future interaction. So I thought that was super interesting. And that shows how, I mean, we all know and research shows that reforming the police is super hard. And there are even like some work, as Janilda Gonzalez work, that show that the monopoly, like the representation of the police as the monopoly of force, like prevents reform, but like the preferences of those young men who are in the barrios, like that they know their experience, that is also hindering police reform through like not implementing it when they are in the field, which I thought that was super interesting. And something that that it's connected to the sixth chapter also is the absence of women in the police. So they like and women are present for the government only in a very maternal and very stereotypical role, as in charge of preventing their son from engaging in criminal activities. But additionally, and that's something that it's present in both chapters, is that we don't know how these women are resisting violence, because there's a small part when you talk about how a woman professor in the police university, after being threatened with rape, because the way she teaches the class, she retorts to very like also like a violent reaction. And I wonder, I mean, so the government sees these women as just like outsourcing their responsibilities of safety, but I wonder like how does these women react to that context in a way that it's like similar to this hyper masculinized way as the men do, or do they have like other forms that are related? Because like the way that the teacher reacts is not like this like stereotypical like gender female way to react to. So I thought that would be like something very interesting to some further research. And last, So like this shows that there were no incentives for any policies on gender equality because the women were only useful in this private space, which is usually demanded for them. And like the Bolivarian revolution kept them there, right? Like they were only useful to the political project by controlling their sons and not by being like an egalitarian part of the revolution as political subjects. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This is fantastic work.
Is it okay if I sit here? Yeah, okay. So thank you for the material that you shared with us. I also read the introductions. I just found the whole project so fascinating. I look forward to reading the entire book. So I read 2 chapters, and one has to do with chapter 4, which is basically about kind of the dispersal of coercive power, especially under the period of Chavez, and how this really sets the conditions for the fragmentation of the entire security apparatus and all of these different discourses, but also actions around how to maintain security and how that's really thought. And I'm going to say a few things about it, but I'm going to have a few questions for you. And they come from a place of just, I want to know more and more about this. It's just, this project is so fascinating. Let me begin, however, by just underscoring the need and the centrality for a project like this. Even though there's been a fair amount of work done by human rights groups mapping and following the level of state repression carried out by the Venezuelan government, we don't really have very many sustained studies about the complexity of the security apparatus in Venezuela, especially at this granular level. So we know there are a lot of different actors, we know they're in competition with one another, but we don't really have a lot of systematic analysis of this done with this level of sophistication. So it really is an absolutely impressive intellectual project. And I think just kind of politically and morally, it's quite needed as well. It is a contribution to human rights in many respects, and it should be recognized as that. So in chapter 4, Rebecca talks a lot about the rise of these colectivos. So colectivos, you can translate them in a number of different ways, but they're basically kind of these parastatal, highly ideological security groups. They look like gangs, but they have support of parts of the state. And the chapter traces how, with the rise of these colectivos, they start kind of edging out the role and the place of other police forces, even as other types of group units are being created. Now, in kind of the more traditional literature on state security apparatuses, we know that authoritarian leaders often have this balancing act. They want to fragment the security apparatus so they don't get overthrown and assassinated. So you need a Praetorian Guard, you need people on your side, especially revolutionary authoritarian systems. But at the same time, they need some degree of kind of coherence to them so they can maintain power and repress, right? This is the coup-proofing problem in the coup literature. And here we see a variation of it, though with much more sensitivity, I think, to context. So the colectivos emerge, and there's that great photo that you had earlier about that water tank or whatever it is, with Chavez on one side and the leader of La Piedrita, one of the most really kind of influential colectivos. In a lot of authoritarian settings, what we would basically see is eventually the leader of a group like of a powerful colectivo, they'd probably get assassinated or purged. Or somewhere along the line, they die, right? Kind of knife along knives kind of situation like you had in 1933 in Nazi Germany. But in any case, that's not exactly what we see here. So the chapter traces out in a really sophisticated way this kind of plurality or plurally violent contexts, which shows us how these different actors are interacting with one another, not only against one another, but also in the process of extracting resources and wealth, kind of terrorizing the local population, and also functioning in some kind of quasi but not very compelling security, law and order kind of context. What I find fascinating about this chapter is several things. I should say there are several things I find fascinating about it. One is the way in which you, in your interviews, you elicit from the officers of the regular police forces how they themselves see a shift in their role and their place. So this is during the Chavez period, right? This is chapter 4. They see a politicization of security, and that's tied to the kind of the ideological commitments of the revolution, it's a revolutionary movement, but also the redistribution of power, of over-ordering space, and that's to use Rebecca's language specifically. So there's this kind of complexity here, this fragmentation, this complex landscape happening. But we also see this turning out, in some cases, into real cases of violence. We see there's this fantastic case that we talk about, the Quinta Crespo massacre, where you have a police unit, the CICPC, in a shootout with one of the colectivos, Escudo de Revolución, the Shield of the Revolution. It's crazy, right? There's just this shootout. And you saw kind of a clip of something different there between two different police forces. And in the end, it's the members of the formal police force that actually get arrested and get punished. So this raises profound questions about who's in charge, which is one of the questions I'm gonna have for you a little bit later in a few moments. But who actually is in charge here, right? You have these units that are meant to defend the revolution. That's right, extremely violent, extremely corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. But the government sides with them. And it's a little bit of kind of an unknown as to who the government is gonna side with in any one of these instances. Whereas before the so-called Bolivarian Revolution, the state had relatively firm monopoly on the security apparatus. You see this kind of start fragmenting in this context. So a few questions for you about this chapter. I was wondering if the examples that you give us in this chapter, do you see this as primarily reflecting what's happening in Caracas, what's happening in cities more generally? Is there variation rural versus city? I mean, you know, we've seen colectivos transform themselves over time, especially in border areas with Colombia, where they're heavily involved in drug trade and all this stuff, and trafficking, et cetera. But I was wondering if you could say something about to what extent you see variation across these spaces, metropole versus periphery, border versus some centrality, et cetera. It's both a kind of methodological question, but also just a question of curiosity. And then I was wondering if you could say something about whether there are a few general configurations of colectivos. So for instance, some of them seem pretty fragmentary. Some of them seem surround or focus primarily on a highly charismatic figure. But we all know the thing about charismatic figures is all you have to do is kill them, right? Decapitate them. Well, I mean, I'm a peace professor, so. But by defense, I work on violence. No, but I mean, you know, so you decapitate the leadership and you effectively seem like you can neutralize it, but it also fragments into other groups, right? Because they already have clandestine ways of moving money, weapons, people, et cetera. So I'm curious if you could say something about kind of, you know, unitary, their internal cohesion points, and whether there are general configurations of it. So there are 2 or 3 general ways that we might see this. Also, I was curious about kind of defection among colectivos and gangs. So we see this stuff with kind of more typically gangs and even politicized gangs where you might have defection usually over opportunistic reasons. I get more money if I work with them. If I leave this neighbor, I go there. So could you say something about how that, if that happens, and if so, how it connects to kind of ideological commitments? I'm going to say a few things about chapter 7 now. So chapter 7, which focuses more on Maduro, the current dictator, focuses on the transformation, the transition. This is kind of more of the police forces, the variety of police forces. The transition from policing and detaining to really having orders to kill, or at least a license to kill. It's probably a better way to put it. So whereas as Rebecca very convincingly puts forth, whereas in a lot of the popular media and human rights reports, we see the problem of state violence as one of targeting dissidents and political prisoners, which is of course absolutely true. This particular chapter focuses on violence primarily as a form of social control and a way of controlling neighborhoods that are seen as a law and order threat. So it's a little bit different here, the vibe. And this is tied up with all sorts of classist and racist elements. As someone who grew up in Venezuela, you know, as I was reading, I was like, yes, this is really awful. Yes, you're absolutely correct. This really hits a lot of notes. One of the things that is fascinating about this chapter is the ways in which not only you get access to all these interviews and you speak to people who are really pretty open about what they're experiencing, but the way you're able to construct for us a sense of how not only behavior and patterns change, but also the formal procedures and rules that are given to police units. So that there is a sense, for instance, from the top down, that killing is part of law and order policies, that a certain number of raids and killings is expected. There are quotas to be met. And when those quotas are kind of open-ended, that has to be filled by someone, otherwise you're not doing your job. But it gives us kind of free license and reign. So what we see here is police forces that engage in significant amounts of violence, partly because that's the orders, but also opportunistically and parasitically. And there's this really fascinating set of interviews here, where you talk about how even some members of the police units carrying out these raids, they talk about how it's dysfunctional, it's disorganized, it's awful, but how they feel sometimes it underscores how the institutions themselves are unable to actually establish law and order. So they're kind of disgusted with what they're doing, even though they're implicated in it. I could say a lot more, but I have just a few questions and I'll stop. One is, and you showed the chart here, but it's in the manuscript, you show this massive increase in police killings from 2015 to 2019, and then it has this downward trend. I was wondering if you could say something about that. Is that a capacity problem? Because it's not like Maduro, woke up one day and, Maduro's Maduro, right? So what explains that downward trend? The capacity problem, the fragmentation, et cetera. And then related to that, how reliable are these numbers? A second question is about Diosdado Cabello, right? So Diosdado Cabello, for those of you who are familiar with Venezuela, very powerful kind of number 2 figure, eminence Greece kind of guy. He's had all these different portfolios as minister, extremely corrupt, is intimately tied, particularly collectivos, with all these different military units, drug trafficking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When I look at someone like him, I'm still wondering why he's alive. So, I mean, so you'd think he'd be dead by now. They would have assassinated him or something. But what's the place of someone like him? This is very particularist. It's not an institutionalist or systemic question. It's a question about the place of a guy who is very wily and has been able to kind of figure out how to survive and thrive. What's his place in a story like this when we're talking about all these different military units? I have so much more to say, but I'll stop here. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Rachel, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to discuss this book. The chapters that I read were really, as Ernesto said, really fascinating. They give such a fine-grained look into this regime and new textures of violence. Rebecca's analysis, one of the key contributions is that it's scaling across multiple levels of state control. So she's moving beyond the conventional focus on like center-periphery or center-proxy relationships, where the key relationship being negotiated is between the center and an arrival, some incorporation of a gang or criminal organization. Moving beyond that to examine these meso-level relationships of the state or state-like actors in this new renegotiation of power and policing between the formal police and these community collectivos. This book is building understandings of what happens under conditions of authoritarian survival, as well as state breakdown, both institutionally and in the use of coercion. She's putting front and center to us that these conditions of authoritarian survival are much more one of the fragmentation of the arms of the states and their strategic redistribution and redeployment among contending actors, rather than a search for the centralization of control. And she's also juxtaposing this idea of an authoritarian state seeking survival with an also inefficient state alongside one that still deploys paperwork and uses paperwork in administration and as an instrument to make society visible and transparent, but also a state that doesn't necessarily have the monopoly of control over how its own symbols are being deployed. This is a novel approach to look at the use of sovereign violence that not only exceeds and overruns and transforms institutional boundaries, but also in terms of taking a look at how permeable boundaries themselves spill over into the reconstitution of state institutions themselves. So in so doing, she's reframing for us what some core institutions of the state are. The police here is more than an instrument of repression. It's not simply a coordinated entity capable of regulating society, but it's transforming into this dynamic social force operating with state affiliations, but also through varied relationships with the government itself. The book is well written and engaging with convincing firsthand accounts and really, really impressive field research that both draws out the personhood and the agency of the individuals who Rebecca got access to, as well as situates herself within that context as well. So I had the opportunity to read chapters 4 and 8 of this book. So I'll briefly summarize some of their main points and then come to some of the main contributions and also questions that I would love to be able to dig into a little bit more. So chapter 4 takes up the question of who guards the guardians, and Rebecca shows that the state does not consolidate control over power by centralizing coercion, but rather by supporting armed community groups, albeit inconsistently. So hence the pathway toward consolidating authority lies through the decentralization of the use of force. And the chapter traces the institutional evolution of colectivos, originally from community protection groups, through this post-coup period, where Chavez grew increasingly distrustful of the police and switched to supporting collectivos through an on and off mode of support. And the support transforms from initial clandestine support to increasingly overt. So much so that these collectivos become intertwined with the police and with the formal security apparatus in the conceptualization of the barrio residents themselves. And Rebecca argues that collectivos have taken an upper hand vis-a-vis police, which is a key difference in this environment of repression and violence. Chapter 8 brings this argument forward by also examining how the relationships between collectivos, these formerly non-state armed groups that are arguably now just as state as the police themselves, how this relationship between the collectivos and the government were perceived by the police officers, and how these perceptions in turn affected officers' trust in the state security institutions and symbols themselves. The chapter begins with a fascinating vignette of the privatization of state power by one of the police forces themselves. So it begins with Rebecca in a car with police forces as this car breaks down, and police officers asking themselves, how are we going to replace the tires on this car? And so taking a look at how police officers in this privatized role take on their formal trappings as police officers to stop cars, check paperwork, and essentially secure the rides and material that they would need themselves to fix their own vehicle. So the chapter starts with this interplay of the privatization of state power within the formal police forces, and then juxtaposes that alongside the increasing formalization of power, the incorporation into the state of these collectivos. So alongside this, Rebecca traces the provision of social services by collectivos, from providing health ambulances during COVID-19 to also performing state-like roles like taxation, providing materials for home repair as well. She is also examining the use of paperwork by different factions, which I found particularly fascinating, finding that under conditions of fragmentation, state symbols themselves don't fade away, but they're used, reused, and redeployed by other societal actors, refashioning relationships to the state and what constitutes state power themselves. Throughout this chapter, she gives many textured, fine-grained accounts of how police officers register their concerns that collectivo members have shifted from an external threat against the state and against the police to being intertwined and infiltrated into police themselves, from obtaining credentials and uniforms from state actors themselves. So she notices the shift in how officers' narratives are treating the incorporation of the collectivos. So I have these chapters together raise several really important thematic questions that travel to diverse literatures on the use of violence, on state control, and on political institutions. One of the main contributions, and also areas that I would be curious to dig more into, is understanding the general process and the overall distribution of coercive power. So we have these three separate actors that Rebecca is drawing us between the central government, between police forces and collectivos. And I wonder, within this relationship, what is the role of the central state? When is the central state benefiting, and in what ways, from the roles that the collectivos are playing for them? In chapter 8, there's this discussion of how the collectivos are providing social services, and I wonder, are these roles that the collectivos are providing, is this legitimacy accruing simply to the collectivos, or is it also accruing to the central government in some way? Are are the services that the collectivos are providing, are they substituting and displacing the police? Or is there also like a parceling out of different sectors and shared authority between different factions of the police and collectivos in different areas? So I'm curious about more of this relational format. And I'm also curious, like, what is the role of central control amidst all of that? How does the central government maintain this balance between the collectivos and the police? Is the central government simply responding to fragmentation? Or is it actively created an order in which collectivos displace the police? Has the central government lost control over this process? Or does it maintain control? So is this still accruing to the government, or are we seeing just a fragmentation of state power that the central government is unable to manage in itself? In terms of institutions, there's also a clear contribution to the broader literature here on state-society relationship. Migdal also notes that under conditions of weakness, authoritarian states can pulverize institutions and parcel them out to society. In order to maintain power. The incorporation of collectivos in Venezuela appears to be part of the shift. There's also a broader contribution within Rebecca's book on the literature on public authority from below, and the literature on street level bureaucracy rather, which includes bureaucrats in uniforms, police, and argues that even under conditions of fragmentation, we need to take these institutions seriously in terms of understanding the relationships that animate these institutions. Some minor questions. I'm curious about whether there's variation in the types of relationships between individual police units and collectivos. Are police units more or less interchangeable, or are there certain factions or units with more loyalty to the government or who work more hand in glove with collectivos? Have these relationships evolved and changed over time as well? Is there variation in terms of how collectivos organize as well, in terms of the relationships that they draw on, the levels of autonomy versus loyalty to the government? Do some collectivos ever form alliances with each other or with the police against the central government? And how has this shifted with the privatization and informalization of the police forces alongside the formalization of the collectivos themselves? Finally, and I'd just like to close on this, I think that there are major methodological contributions in this book. Both chapters 4 and 8, Rebecca plays with the questions of what is the role of rumor. She's really upfront that in the exchanges with the police officers themselves, it's quite difficult to parse reality from rumor. And indeed, it's the point of clandestine connections to remain covert. So it's really difficult to get at the underlying ground truth here. And she acknowledges that much of the data is presented as narratives and perceptions. And she doesn't take officers' stories necessarily at face value as factual representations of a certain encounter or event, but uses them to indicate changes in coercive power and shows that even if rumors may not be factually accurate, they still shape the officers' conceptions and shape their behavior as well. So I think that alongside this book, maybe there's room for more of a methodological reflection on how we can treat rumors and when is it important to understand a ground truth that's going on, and when is it sufficient to simply understand the role that these narratives have and how these narratives shape power and reorganize, even in the absence of understanding how they may be linked to the empirical transformations of power. So thanks, Rebecca, for letting me read your chapters. It was really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to discussing further.
You have a lot to address, but maybe you can take 5 minutes to respond and then we open.
Oh, right.
Unless you want to open.
No, I can go ahead and try to respond to some of these. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the wonderful comments. It really helped me to think about maybe projects moving forward, and it may ways to kind of maybe make sense of finding whether work applies. In terms, yeah, so, Mayra, your questions about, I mean, I'm really glad that you, yeah, picked up on this tension between lived experiences of police officers, and the reform itself. I mean, one of the reasons why I think this is really important is that most resistance to police reform gets couched as like a problem of police culture in police institutions, rather than thinking about how men come into the police force already with some ideas about violence and aggression. So, I'll go and to your questions about women, which I think is really important. So yeah, the police reform actually implemented like a percentage quota that police forces were supposed to meet. So they were supposed to get up to like a 20% like threshold for police officers, which they never actually did, but there was an effort to increase women's participation. Though I didn't notice with the women police officers, they had very different perspectives on violence or use of force, which is really interesting. How are women resisting violence? Yeah, I don't talk about this very much in this book. I have worked on it in other work, kind of thinking about what are the resources. So this chapter 6 that I look at women is largely focused on the ways in which women are positioned as mothers and how that's related to crime fighting initiatives. And so in other research that I've looked at, we kind of try to consider the ways in which women can use their positions as mothers to negotiate with other armed groups. Less so kind of thinking about, I mean, the one last thing I'll say about this is that how do women react to this individualization of security? They're on board with it a lot of the time, because the individualization of security that happens in Venezuela is very much so drawn from popular discourse and belief. So I didn't show this graph, but we have survey data over a number of years asking people basically like, what do you think is the main cause of crime in Venezuela? And people can list different things, but we ask folks, what's the main reason why you think crime exists in Venezuela? And people say the decline of the family. And what they mean by that is that the decline of values that mothers are transferring to their children. And so this isn't just like a top-down issue of the government trying to convince women that they are being good mothers, or trying to convince people that it's an issue of motherhood. It's a very popular belief that existed long before Chavismo. And so like Chavista logic and discourse kind of confirms that. Let's see, I'm gonna try to bring together some questions. Okay, so, oh goodness, yes, sorry. So yeah, in terms of what's going on with the colectivos, this is the project I'm working on right now, is trying to get a better idea, more specific idea of how the colectivos operate, variation among them, because there's definitely variation among them. I mean, the colectivos for most of this period of time were an urban phenomenon. They really didn't start to filter out into rural areas until, we don't have a good estimation, but I would probably say like the past 4 or 5 years, maybe. Again, there's not enough good data to be, but we know that for most of their history, they've been a very urban phenomenon. The issue is here also that it's increasingly difficult to separate out gangs and colectivos, because in the past it was very clear that colectivos had a very clear ideological vision that they were oriented around. Now, so there are newer colectivos like Raíces that very much so operates as a gang and kind of utilizes government ideology to kind of justify what they're doing and to build relationships with the state. So it's like massive pluralization of these collectivos, it's difficult to kind of say anything kind of specifically about them. And they continue to change. I mean, I think what I would kind of try to wrap this up by saying that, what we've seen is increased pluralization of these actors and more consolidated relationships with the government as the government tries to kind of legalize them and justify their participation in that's a very top-down vision, but I'd be happy to talk about it. Let's see, and then I'll just say one thing, Rachel, I really appreciated these comments. The question about the central government maintaining balance and losing control, I think is really important here. This issue of shared authority, I think, is really helpful for me to kind of think about, because the project that I'm working on right now is continuing to think about these relationships between gangs, between the colectivos, and between the police. So really kind of trying to focus on all 3 groups at the same time. So kind of trying to figure out who's benefiting from these relationships and how is really useful for me. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's super interesting. I will gladly read the book. I think that it's to understand everything. But I was wondering about some things about the relationship between, because our last graph you show is like the homicide rate is decreasing, right? So this could be seen as a success But in terms of, it would be very interesting to see it in terms of human rights and rule of law. Like if there's a decrease in the homicide rate, there's also a decrease in the quality of human rights exercise and rule of law. And also because that will, like it's happening in El Salvador, no? That the end justifies the means. And also, another interesting thing that I would see, or I don't know if it's this research or in your next research, is like, this is a strategy, can we call it a strategy or not? And if the decrease of the homicide is a result of the strategy or despite, you know? It's something about this fragmentation of state power. If the state wants to do it, and it's like Rachel asked if the central state is still having control or not. And probably the factors that made the decrease of the homicide rate is not because of the strategy, but despite. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so this allows me actually to get back to a question that you asked that I didn't get to. But yeah, in terms of the homicide rate, yes, it's very much the case that violence has gone down and human rights violations have increased dramatically due to these operations that the operativos that I mentioned. I mean, so it's during this time period that the Venezuelan government starts to be investigated by the International Criminal Court for massive human rights violations. So there's absolutely, you know, hand-in-hand relationship here. The problem is that out of the things that Maduro has done as president, these policing initiatives are the most popular thing that he has that he's done while president. So human rights violations have increased dramatically, but they've also been incredibly popular, the initiatives that I talked about. So yeah, there's a very clear relationship between those things. In terms of, because you asked about, so between homicide rate and police violence going down is something that I'm working on right now with a couple of people. It really seems to be that, honestly, this human rights, the human rights case that gets opened in the International Criminal Court, and this comes from police officers. They say, basically, the government told us, like, bájale dos, you know, like, take it down a couple of notches because we're gaining too much attention here. So there was I mean, I don't think it was like Maduro saying, like, oh, we should probably stop doing this, but instead, like, this isn't a good look for us. Let's probably try to walk this back a little bit. So I think between COVID and the ICC case, that resulted in this decrease in homicide rates. I mean, in police violence. In homicide rates, yes. So I think this was an unintended consequence of multiple strategies that had nothing to do with each other and what they produced. So, and this is the hard thing when I talk about Venezuela, that usually these things are the outcome of, like, unintended consequences of so many things happening at the same time. And so the way that, I actually just wrote a piece about this, the way that I and a couple other researchers explain this drop in homicide, the recent drop in homicide rates. So Trump obviously has said it's because of our migration. Like, you know, Maduro has sent all of the criminals to the United States. Maduro has said that homicide has gone down because of these policing initiatives that I talked about. Empirically, what seems to be happening is actually the case that these policing initiatives resulted in gang consolidation. So there's less conflict between gangs. So the policing initiatives did reduce homicides, but not for the reasons that Maduro said. It's not because they completely eliminated gangs, which they did eliminate some, but for the most part, they resulted in like a articulation of multiple gangs that literally decided, like, we're going to stop fighting with each other. We're going to divide up territory. And that's what resulted in the reduction in homicide rates rather than these police initiatives themselves. So I think it was a strategy, but not necessarily the outcomes that they thought were going to come out of that strategy.
Thank you so much.
I think in the back, the first hand I saw.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing about this drop in the homicide rate, I wonder how much this can be attributed to these policies. How much this is just a turn of, like, the denominator, like the amount of people. Like, generally, homicides tend to occur among young males. 20% of the people have left Venezuela. Among young males, I guess that's 30–40%. So I guess whether this is just an numeric thing. The last census in Venezuela, I think it was 2011. So.
Yeah, thanks. This was really a fascinating talk. I haven't read the book, but question, these are two questions that are basically the same thing about what's happening to the idea of authority in first, and whether that leaves any room for entrepreneurship all of this, because, you know, you presented it really as kind of a structural given to specific gangs. So the two things that come to mind are, there's a discussion of what's, you know, targeting of women as reproducing delinquents, and that this seems to have a very negative effect on women's autonomy and the way they're policed. Are there other ways in which a sort of a breakdown in central authority has allowed women to form more autonomous community organizations, create alternative visions of what a women's led local authority would look like, or is this not what's happening? And similarly with writing, I mean, it's partly what I'll be talking about next week, is like writing can, in a very chaotic situation, allow anybody to sort of present themselves as an authority if received in that way. And I wonder again if, like it was mentioned that you've written about how gangs are using written directives to sort of claim you know, function of the state. Can anybody just write a directive and the sense of uncertainty about who's in charge leads people to obey it? Or is this something that people recognize that like there's some underlying sense of authority with the gangs, or is it the performance of the writing that
Yeah, so first of all, congratulations. You must feel really good too.
Yeah, be done with
Have
it, yeah.
this out in the world. I really look forward to reading the book. It's just based on hearing you talk and hearing the discussing comments. I think this is a tremendously important contribution to sort of what we know about authoritarian regimes. I think, at least from a political science perspective, we have a sort of pretty straightforward story about how revolutionary authoritarian regimes in particular sort of consolidate power and operate. And it seems like you're kind of overturning a lot of that conventional wisdom, which I think is great. So I have two questions. The first is, I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about the history of these special police units, the OLP and FAIS. So you mentioned that the Colectivo members were increasingly incorporated into them. And just sort of thinking more comparatively, I'm also, you know, I find it fascinating, one, how these sort of elite units get created as sort of pockets of discretion meant to improve effectiveness of security forces. And then of course, they kind of go off the rails and do whatever they want, right? But I'm aware of cases in which those kinds of units were actually sort of created by non-state actors and then slowly incorporated into the state. And so we kind of see a reversal in some ways, which I think is really interesting. So I guess that's less of a question and more of just a provocation. But then the second question I have is also kind of pushing us to think comparatively, which is not quite fair because I know this is a book about Venezuela. But I'm really curious about sort of why we get such a conflicted relationship between the police and the colectivos, because there are cases, I mean, I'm thinking about Nicaragua in particular, where, right, the police forces, after having gone through a period of reform and becoming more independent in the 1990s and early 2000s, they're again politicized, and they kind of end up slotting into this sort of broader repressive apparatus alongside partisan organizations at the local level. And so I'm curious sort of why we get this sort of outcome in the Venezuelan case, whereas it seems to me there could have been hypothetically a world in which, you know, the police kind of colludes with these actors in a much more sort of, I don't know, cooperative or not peaceful, but cooperative way, I guess.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so in terms of the question, so you're basically asking, like, can we just attribute this drop in homicides to migration of young men out of the country, more or less? There are two ways I think to think about that. One, I think the presence of young men engaging in crime is not what drives violence. I mean, if you look at illicit markets themselves don't even drive violence. It's disrupted illicit markets. So I think about this from a much more structural and institutional way than from just like individual men being available, biographically available to engage in crime. I think this is a more kind of structural and kind of contextual issue to think about. But there have been, not me, because I don't do this type of work, there have been a couple of people who have calculated the outmigration of young men and have said there's no way that it can account for there's like a 42% drop in homicide rates that happened beginning in 2016, which is just extraordinary, particularly given the high rates that existed in the country before. So I think there is a contributing factor. It's clearly not enough to explain like the massive drop. I think it's much more important to kind of think about what's going on with illicit markets at the time, which is why I'm interested in this issue of like gang consolidation, because that would suggest that illicit markets still exist. They're just much less disruptive. They're much more stable, and that results in less violence. So yes, in terms of entrepreneurship, yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, I didn't observe any, so I will say that recently, I would say like in the past like 5 or 6 years, women have gotten together to protest police violence and killings of their children. This happened much later than in other countries like Colombia. Like Janila's work shows like in Colombia and Brazil, like those countries have had women's organizations for decades that protested police violence against their sons. This has only happened relatively recently in Venezuela. So that does exist, but I'm not aware of any other kind of like bottom up initiatives, I guess, to deal with security issues by women. I will say that the few kind of bottom up conversations that I saw were completely in line with the government's discourse, unfortunately. So there was this one woman in a community meeting who said like, oh, I'm starting a new initiative to reduce crime in the neighborhood. It's women have to disarm their children because the police cannot. So like literally saying like women are the ones who need, this very much goes on to your point about like this gender, like assumptions, very heteronormative ideas about gender, like women are peacemakers, so they therefore can take guns away from men. So unfortunately the more grassroots response that I saw was very much so in line with this like broader idea about women being responsible for crime. And yeah, in terms of directives, I mean, yeah, this is a huge conversation. I would say, I mean, I think the gangs that have a more hierarchical structure and have kind of norms, explicit norms about how to do things and what to do, there's a very particular historical development of them, right? And so they are allowed to do this because they have spent a long time organizing, and then they build a particular relationship with the government, which then provides them with some degree of legitimacy. The government basically saying you're allowed to do this in this space. So it's not just like a bottom-up issue, but a top-down issue of the government saying like, yes, you can run, the territory in which you're operating. So I think it's, both reasons complementing each other. Let's see. Okay, so I'll just get to the last question about why is there such conflict here? There is some collaboration, definitely, and this happens for a couple of different reasons. The reason why I focus so much on conflict is that when I was initially writing about this topic, it was a time period when all like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and a bunch of news organizations were reporting on this like massive and clear collaboration between the police and the colectivos at protests. And all I was seeing on the ground was police officers being very upset about the colectivos being present. I mean, there's nothing that I saw, which is not to say there's not some degree of collaboration, but I think it's very easy to kind of focus on this issue of like police collaborating with non-state armed groups. Also because I just think we don't ask the police. I mean, it's weird to say like, oh, we should give the police more attention, but I think I engage with like this scholarship on gray zones, and there has been a massive increase in relationships between police and criminal organizations, and all of that literature says that the police are benefiting from gangs and these other non-state armed groups existing. And I really wanted to intervene in this conversation and say that's not the case all of the time. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense the police would be on board with the government saying, we're going to give the power that you've always had, for, like not only to control the impunity that you have, and we're going to transfer it to another group. So it just seems surprising to me that that's something that hasn't come up more. So I guess my response to that is like, I think it's probably existing in other cases as well. We just paid less attention to it because there's been so much focus on this like collaborative aspect.
Yeah, I wanted a question, a reflection from Rebecca's comment or question on this relationship between the colectivos and the police. I think the overall model here, it's based on the Cuban model of keeping the police as defender of society, defenders of the citizens against crime. And they're being careful in protecting the figure of the police in not doing atrocities. That's the same pattern that I noticed in Nicaragua, for example. And I believe, I was in jail, but I believe the repression that the Cuban regime did in July 21 was mostly conducted by people defending the revolution, not necessarily the police itself. So, and it's a similar pattern with Nicaragua. And the reason why you see that is because it's easier for the paramilitaries, the parapolice to hide the crimes. They're usually hooded and not wearing police uniforms, although they might be officers, police officers, or even army officers. So it's easier for the regime to actually maintain the cleanliness of the police and say, you know, these irregulars are doing that. Now, in terms of the conflict between the police and the colectivos, I would say that is the result of the lack of enforcement of keeping the system organized, as in the case of Nicaragua. In the case of Nicaragua, the paramilitaries are obeying orders from the maybe in Venezuela, there might be a vacuum of chain of command there. So, and in addition, you know, collectivos might be involved in illicit local enterprises, so to speak.
Yeah, so the project I'm working on right now at Kellogg with Veronica Subillaga, we are thinking about the reason why colectivos and gangs have, the relationship between gangs and colectivos and the government have expanded, partially for the reasons you're talking about. You know, in some ways it's easier to outsource repression. I mean, I think in the case of Venezuela, the police are still very important in that repression story. So I haven't seen cases where the colectivos are engaging in more, I guess, like delicate issues of repression. They really just kind of seem to be an additional force, not necessarily one that's filling in where the police cannot. So I think this is something we're kind of still trying to figure out. We're still kind of trying to work out. But it is definitely the case that the government has become increasingly dependent on the colectivos and their repression over in recent years. So I think that's kind of a question. But I think looking at the Cuban case, and of course, like, as we've talked about a little bit, like it's on the back burner, but eventually we have to do a comparison with Nicaragua. I mean, there's just no way like around that. In terms of why there's police colectivo conflict. I mean, to me, what's really interesting about this question, both with gangs and the colectivos, is that the police regularly disobey the government's rules. So the Quinta Crespo event that Ernesto was talking about a minute ago, with the police like directly disobeying like the government's wishes that the colectivos not be masked, right? And that's happened in the case of gangs as well. So you have these sporadic police, and so this is where the third point that I talked about that I wasn't really going to be able to get to, where that third point comes in. Because I think it's those moments where the police are openly defying the government and its orders to attack armed groups, to attack Nazi armed groups, where we see the police really resisting. So I do think it's an issue of order, but I think it's also the police really trying to deploy some degree of agency and, you know, mark in some way their discontent with what's going on, which sounds weird to be like the police resisting the state, but I do think that that's the case in some of these violent encounters. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. We look forward to reading the book, and thank you, Mayra, thank you, Ernesto, and thank you, Rachel, for joining us today.
Thanks, Rebecca.